When my husband admitted he'd spent every dollar in our savings account, he expected me to cry. Instead, I asked him one question. "Is there anything else you want to tell me?" He smiled and said, "No." What he didn't know was that I'd been keeping one bank account he'd never heard of. Not because I planned to leave him, but because my grandmother once taught me the difference between trust and dependence. Stick with me while I share my story, and if it touches you, don't forget to support our channel by hitting that subscribe button, dropping a like, and sharing it with the people you care about. My name is Rachel Bennett. I'm 36 years old. I work as a senior financial analyst outside Denver, and I've spent my career doing exactly what you'd expect from someone in that field: reading numbers carefully, noticing patterns before they turn into problems, building safety nets long before anyone tells me I'll need them. What I never expected was that I'd end up applying every one of those instincts inside my own marriage. Mark and I had been married 8 years when everything I'm about to describe finally came to a head. We met at a mutual friend's barbecue, back when he was working his way up at a car dealership and I was still finishing my degree. He made me laugh within the first 5 minutes, that easy, effortless charm that pulled people toward him without him seeming to try very hard at all. He still has that quality, honestly. It was never the problem. Mark works as a luxury car sales manager now, a job he's genuinely good at, the kind of role that rewards someone charismatic, quick on his feet, comfortable in a room full of wealthy strangers. He's funny, he's generous, at least with other people, always the first to pick up a check at dinner with friends, always offering to help someone move on a Saturday. For most of our marriage I would have called him a good husband without hesitating. His weakness, the one I didn't fully understand until it nearly cost us everything, was never gambling, and it was never another woman. It was appearances. Mark has always wanted, more than almost anything else, for people to look at our life and believe we were more successful than we actually were. I should say, before I go any further, that I carry some responsibility for how long it took me to see this clearly. I've always given people second chances, more of them than is probably wise, because I genuinely believe most people are capable of change if they're given room to make it. That belief has served me well in a lot of areas of my life. In this particular situation, it meant I spent nearly a year explaining away things I should have questioned much sooner. For the first several years of our marriage, we were, by almost every measure, a great team. We weren't wealthy, not even close, but we were comfortable, and more importantly, we were disciplined. We saved faithfully every month, building toward a down payment on a house, setting aside a little extra for the children we hope to have someday, keeping a solid emergency fund for whatever life might throw at us. I managed our budget, mostly because I enjoy that kind of work and I'm good at it. Mark earned a solid income at the dealership, especially during good sales quarters, and for a long time, our financial life together felt exactly like the partnership I'd always hoped a marriage would be. Before I go further, I want to explain something about my own history, because it matters for what comes later. My grandmother, who passed away several years before Mark and I got married, was a woman who'd lived through more financial hardship than most people I've known. She raised 3 children largely on her own after my grandfather left, and she never remarried, choosing instead to build a quiet, careful life entirely on her own terms. A few years before my wedding, she sat me down at her kitchen table, the same table where she taught me to balance a checkbook when I was 12, and told me something I've never forgotten. "Every woman should always have enough money to choose freedom," she said. Not because she plans to leave. Because life is unpredictable. She wasn't warning me about Mark specifically, she barely knew him at the time. She was simply passing along a piece of hard-earned wisdom, the kind you only really understand once you've lived through the alternative. I took her advice quietly, without any production, and without ever imagining I'd actually need it. Over the years of my marriage, I set aside small amounts of my own earnings, money from freelance consulting work on the side, a modest inheritance from an aunt, the occasional work bonus, and moved them into an account Mark never knew existed. It wasn't deception in the way that word usually implies. It was simply mine, built from money I'd earned independently, kept quietly in the background of a marriage I fully intended to spend the rest of my life in. The changes in Mark started small enough that individually, none of them seemed worth an alarm. He came home one evening with a new watch, an expensive one, the kind of brand I recognized even without knowing much about watches. When I asked, he said something about needing to look the part for his clients, that people expect a certain image from someone selling luxury cars, that the watch was practically a business expense. It made a kind of sense, so I let it go. Then came the designer suits, replacing perfectly good ones already hanging in his closet. Then weekend trips with co-workers he described as important networking opportunities, the kind that could lead to bigger accounts down the road. Every purchase came with an explanation reasonable enough on its own, none of them individually large enough to justify a fight. But slowly, almost invisibly, our savings stopped growing the way it used to. I noticed at first the way a financial analyst notices these things, in the numbers themselves, before I'd even fully processed what they meant. Deposits that used to arrive steadily every month got smaller, then inconsistent, then occasionally missing altogether. Credit card balances we'd always kept close to zero started creeping up. Packages started arriving at the house more and more often, always for Mark, always followed by an explanation about a client dinner or a business necessity. I want to be honest about why I didn't push harder during that period. Part of it was genuinely believing him I loved him, and had no real reason at that point to assume he was lying to me. Part of it was simply not wanting to be the kind of wife who nagged about every purchase, who turned every conversation into an accounting exercise. I told myself I was being a good partner by trusting him. Looking back, I think I was also avoiding a conversation I was afraid might reveal something I didn't want to see. The moment everything finally became undeniable happened on an ordinary Tuesday evening. I logged into our joint savings account to check our progress toward the house down payment we'd been discussing more seriously in recent months, and the number on the screen made my stomach drop in a way that took a full minute to process. It was almost zero. My first assumption, genuinely, was fraud. I called the bank immediately, hands not quite steady as I navigated the automated system to reach an actual person. The woman who eventually helped me pulled up the account history and read off, one by one, a series of transfers spanning nearly a year. Every single one had been authorized. Every single one had come from Mark. I sat at our kitchen table that night waiting for him to come home, running through every innocent explanation I could think of, trying to find a version of this that didn't mean what it very plainly seemed to mean. When Mark walked in and I told him what I'd found, he didn't deny it. I remember a strange mix of relief and devastation in that moment, relief that at least he wasn't going to lie to my face about something I already had documented proof of, and devastation because what he actually admitted was, in some ways, harder to hear than if it had simply been an affair or a gambling problem, the kinds of betrayals that at least come with a familiar shape. He hadn't spent it on another woman. He hadn't gambled it away in one reckless moment. He had spent nearly everything we'd carefully saved over almost a year, methodically, maintaining a lifestyle that looked far more successful than what we could actually afford. Luxury car leases beyond what his employee discount covered. Expensive vacations he told me were work-related but weren't. Client gifts that went well beyond anything his job required. An entire wardrobe built around looking, to everyone around him, like a man who'd already made it. I was doing it for us, he said, and I remember that sentence landing somewhere deeper than the money itself ever could have. He genuinely seemed to believe it, that spending our security on the appearance of success was somehow an act of love, rather than a betrayal of the partnership we'd spent years building. In the weeks that followed, I felt a particular kind of foolishness that's hard to describe unless you've lived it. Our friends thought Mark was thriving. His family admired how far he'd come. Nobody around us had any idea how close to broke we actually were, because Mark had spent so much energy curating an image that even I had partly believed it, right up until the numbers finally forced the truth out into the open. Mark, for his part, minimized everything in the days after his confession. "We'll make it back," he told me more than once, as if the problem were a temporary setback rather than a pattern of deception. "You're overreacting," he said another time, when I tried to explain how deeply the lying itself had hurt me more than the money ever could have. "It's just money," he said once, and I remember staring at him, genuinely searching his face for some sign he understood how much more than money had actually been lost. I started quietly questioning myself during that period. I wondered if I'd been too rigid about our finances, too unwilling to let him have the things that seemed to matter so much to him. I wondered if part of this was my fault, for managing the budget so tightly that he felt he had to hide his spending instead of just talking to me about it. It took me some time to recognize that questioning myself that way was itself part of how the situation had been allowed to grow as large as it did. I never went to that account with the intention of using it against him, and I want to be clear about that. When I finally checked it, weeks after his confession, I wasn't plotting an exit or preparing some dramatic reveal. I was simply confirming that the one piece of my financial life he'd never touched was still intact, still exactly where I'd left it, still entirely mine. It wasn't a fortune. It was never meant to be. It was enough, built slowly and legally, over years, to give me options if I ever genuinely needed them. Looking at that balance, quiet and untouched amid everything that had just collapsed around us, I understood, more clearly than I had in a long time, exactly what my grandmother had been trying to teach me all those years ago at her kitchen table. Mark found out about the account almost by accident several weeks later, when he came across a piece of paperwork I'd left on my desk after a call with the bank about a minor account update. I remember the exact look on his face when he confronted me with it that evening, a mixture of hurt and anger that honestly surprised me, given everything that had already happened. "You've been hiding money from me," he said, his voice sharper than I usually heard from him. I stayed calm. I've never found much use in matching someone's anger with my own, especially when I have the facts clearly on my side. "You hid spending," I said. "I protected savings." Neither of us said much for a long moment after that. It was a simple sentence, but I could see, watching his face, that it landed with a weight neither of us had anticipated. The true reckoning, though, didn't come from that conversation in our kitchen. It came a few weeks later, during a meeting we'd scheduled months earlier, before any of this had come to light, with a mortgage officer and a financial planner, to finally move forward on buying our first home. We sat across from her desk, Mark noticeably tense beside me, as she walked methodically through our combined financial picture. I watched her expression shift, subtly but unmistakably, as she moved through the documentation. Every unauthorized transfer from our savings. Every luxury purchase that didn't line up with any reasonable budget. The credit card debt that had accumulated without my full knowledge. A couple of missed payments I hadn't even known about. Then she came across the paperwork for my personal account, which I disclosed honestly as part of the full financial picture required for the mortgage application. She paused, reviewing the figures carefully, then looked up at both of us. Without Rachel's personal savings, she said plainly, no particular emotion in her voice, just stating a fact drawn directly from the numbers in front of her, "You would likely be insolvent right now." The room went completely silent. No shouting, no dramatic confrontation, nothing beyond the simple, undeniable weight of a professional laying out the actual state of our finances, with no room left for Mark's usual explanations. He couldn't argue with the numbers, because the numbers weren't opinions. They were exactly what they were. I want to be honest about what happened after that, because I think it matters just as much as the meeting itself. I didn't use the account I'd built to rescue our marriage, or quietly absorb the damage Mark had caused, the way I might have done a year earlier. Instead, I used a portion of it to secure a rental apartment for myself while we separated, giving both of us the space we genuinely needed to figure out what came next. Mark had to sell the luxury car he'd been leasing, returning it well before the term was up, absorbing whatever penalties came with that. He returned several of the more expensive items he'd bought over the previous year, the ones that could still be returned at all. He moved into a smaller apartment, considerably more modest than the life he'd been trying so hard to project. He had to rebuild his finances honestly, one paycheck at a time, without the safety net that had quietly cushioned his choices for as long as we'd been married. There was no dramatic downfall, not the kind these stories are sometimes told with. Nobody publicly humiliated him. His employer never found out, and his career at the dealership carried on largely unaffected, at least on the surface. What changed was simply reality finally catching up with the image he'd spent so long constructing, the natural consequence of choices that had been quietly deferred for far too long. A year later, I bought a modest townhouse entirely on my own, using savings I'd rebuilt carefully in the months since our separation, along with what remained of the account my grandmother's advice had prompted me to build so many years earlier. I was, for the first time in longer than I could clearly remember, financially secure and completely in control of my own life again. Mark sent me a handwritten letter around that same time, not asking for money, not asking me to reconsider our marriage. just apologizing, in language that felt, for the first time, genuinely honest rather than defensive. He admitted in that letter that he'd confused looking successful with actually building a successful life. That somewhere along the way, he'd started measuring his own worth by what other people assumed about him rather than by anything real underneath it. I accepted his apology. I genuinely believe it was sincere. But I chose not to reconcile. Not out of lingering anger, but because I'd come to understand something important during that year apart. My peace no longer needed to depend on whether or not he'd finally changed. I could wish him well, hope he'd truly learn something lasting from everything that happened, and still choose a life that didn't require me to wait and see whether the change would hold. People often ask me, when I've told parts of this story before, whether keeping that account meant I never really trusted my husband. I understand why they ask, but the truth is more complicated, and I think more honest, than a simple yes or no. I trusted him enough to marry him, and for a long time that trust was well placed. I simply loved myself enough to remember what my grandmother had taught me at her kitchen table, years before any of this happened. Security isn't about expecting the worst from the people you love. It's about making sure that one bad decision, whether it's yours or someone else's, can't quietly destroy your entire future without you ever having a say in the matter. In the end, the money in that account wasn't really what saved me. It was never about the balance itself, which was modest by almost any standard. What actually saved me was the freedom that balance represented, the ability to make a real choice about my own life instead of simply living out a decision that had already been made for me, one hidden transfer at a time, by someone I trusted to make those decisions honestly. I still believe in partnership. I still believe most people are capable of real change, given enough time and enough honesty with themselves. But I no longer believe that loving someone means surrendering every safeguard you've built for yourself, or that questioning a pattern of secrecy makes you disloyal instead of simply awake. My grandmother knew that a long time before I did. I'm grateful, more than I can easily put into words, that I finally listened.